to be looking at, in general, how the Vietnam War was perceived at home, but also some other social happenings in the United States during the 1960s and 70s. So the textbook calls this section a generation in conflict, which I think is a really appropriate title because, as we discussed in the 1950s, the people who were born after World War II, there was a significant gap in their lifestyle compared to their parents, who didn't have that same sense of antagonism towards the government. So by the Vietnam War, these baby boomers were coming of age. They were all in high school and college. So you're going to see that they are much more willing to be opposed to the war. They stand out as the most avid protesters. And part of this is because this generation was more educated than ever before. To a certain extent, this is because colleges became more accessible due to the GI Bill. Even after the GIs graduated, colleges had had to expand to accommodate them. So more and more people are going to school. One of the earliest examples of a major protest at the university level was at the University of California at Berkeley. It was called the Free Speech Movement. Now, this was centered around students who were actually protesting hiring discrimination at their college. And they tried to set up information booths around campus, but the university did not give them permission to do that. And so then the students protest that because they feel as though essentially the school is silencing them. Thousands of students end up protesting on the campus of Berkeley. Joan Baez even joins them and sings "We Shall Overcome." And over 800 people are arrested during these protests, and that's the largest mass arrest of California history. This also shows us that in general, students start to really question whether the universities are there for them or if they're there more as yet another corporate institution that was sort of just churning out their degrees. Was it just to generate profit and not to actually enlighten them? So they kind of saw this as yet another example of the establishment that they wanted to crush. Berkeley is just the beginning. We see a series of other campus movements nationwide, and they are effective to a large extent in that some colleges start to loosen their restrictions. They start to allow students to live off campus, for example. And so that general sense of in loco parentis, which means in the place of parents, this is sort of more like how you would live in your dorm at a like high school boarding school, for example. Colleges start to let up and really treat university students more like independent adults. And this is also significant because, as we know from the beginning of the first video, many of the soldiers in Vietnam were teenagers. So, one of the most iconic groups of people during the Vietnam War era that we think about are the hippies, right? So just sort of this, generation of people that was very much against, that kind of their parents' lifestyle. They were not apt to get married young and settle down and have the nuclear family. They advocated sort of sexual freedom, experimenting with hallucinogenic drugs, listening to music. In 1967, the Summer of Love takes place. This is a large-scale gathering, particularly in San Francisco, of young people. Many of them sort of live in very non-traditional households. Some of them will live in communes, right, which is where sometimes they'll have multiple partners, or they'll be like sort of a swinger lifestyle where, everyone's sort of open to having whatever sexual partners that they want. This is very much sort of challenging that idea of the nuclear family. Having children out of wedlock increased, stuff like that. And some of this is because the birth control pill was patented by the FDA in 1960. And so women in particular felt like they had the liberation to sort of live freely and not be held down by the traditional roles of childbearing. The flower children are also associated with hippie culture. You see, this isn't just wearing flowers in your hair. Some flower children actually actively would protest the military by going up to people holding guns and put flowers down the barrels of the gun. This kind of notion of making love, not war, became very popular. You're going to see that in general, this association of, hippies as the entire population during the war. I think we sort of hyped that up, you know, in the 21st century. Hippies were still the minority, but at the same time, they really made a powerful statement against the war. And of course, one of the other most iconic images we think about with the hippie counterculture movement was the 1969 Woodstock Festival, where, you know, people like Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin performed, had a very anti-war rhetoric. You know, this is one of the most notorious sort of mass celebrations, but also protests that took place among the hippie counterculture movement. All right, so as we already alluded to in the previous video, there's a major increase of anti-war sentiments as it becomes increasingly apparent that the war is not going to be so easily won, like after the Tet Offensive. So you're going to see that students, again, start to organize major protests that question the war effort, and they also start to even question their own university's role in war-related research. So, for example, the University of Michigan had a hiring fair where the Dow Chemical Company participated, and the Dow Chemical Company manufactured napalm, which was used as a poison against the Vietnamese. So it was like a form of chemical warfare. And so students, when they found out that the Dow Chemical Company was coming to give these job interviews, started to protest Dow's presence on their campus. But these students were met with police tear gas. And so in response to that, they decided to boycott going to class for a week. So we start to see that, you know, students are increasingly opposed again to the university, especially how it related to the war. You're going to see that there's going to be a massive number of protests against the war, violent and peaceful. One of the major ways that the youth protested was if they were given a draft card, they would destroy it or burn it. And this is interesting because there actually were laws against this. There was a 1965 act that would give anyone who destroyed a draft card a 5-year prison and a $10,000 fine. It was really hard to actually prosecute this, especially when people were doing it in such large numbers. And so some people did it anyway. And you're going to see that essentially people view their current situation as just as much of a war at home as there is a war abroad. Another major thing is that it was very clear that the troops and also just the general American population was not seen as equal with regards to the war. So even there was a draft, but people could defer if they went to college. Remember, for continuity's sake, that people during the Civil War could defer or actually get someone else to enlist on their behalf by paying $300. So in some ways, this shows us continuity and change, right? You couldn't buy your way out of the draft, but if you went to college, you didn't have to go. So that means that poorer people are disproportionately going to war. They can't avoid the draft. And also the military starts to recruit heavily in poor neighborhoods because they know this. There is an increasingly disproportionate number of Black and Latino soldiers because they are the most likely demographic to not be able to afford to go to college. And when the escalation period in Vietnam reaches its height, you're going to see again, this is not surprisingly taking place during the most tense moments of the civil rights movement. For example, in 1968, remember that this is the same year that Martin Luther King was assassinated, that Medgar Evers was assassinated, that Robert Kennedy was assassinated. You know, that's not a coincidence that things are really tense in Vietnam and things are also really, really bad at home. You're going to see that there's a lot of racial tension among the troops, even abroad. Some of them start to protest that. I didn't put a sign up here. Maybe I should have, but you know, some people would say, you know, like no Asian person ever called me an N-word. You know, so like the idea was that they kind of felt as though they shouldn't have to fight in Vietnam if they weren't treated equally at home. So you actually see some soldiers become much more antagonistic, even against their commanding officers. And like we saw from the image in the background that you can see in the very first slide of the first video, people started to decorate their helmets with anti-war sentiments, wearing peace buttons and writing things like "war is hell." Soldiers started to grow increasingly bitter also over government lies about alleged victories. Also you start to see that when Vietnam soldiers come home, society doesn't accept them the way that they used to accept vets. There are stories of Vietnamese veterans getting spat on when they get home. And this is very hypocritical, obviously, because, you know, they were drafted. Many of them actually fought in this war, and they didn't want to be there. So you're going to see vets, first off, come home to face very poor job prospects because the economy starts to sort of deindustrialize at this point. And also, many of them are still affected by, first off, many of them come home with major injuries, like losing limbs, for example. And other ones, even if they're not physically harmed, are afflicted with PTSD for the rest of their lives. So, Lyndon Johnson is, as we know, I already alluded to this in the previous videos, trying to wage a war on poverty at the same time that the escalation in Vietnam is amping up. So just like the progressive movement, some of the war on poverty was brought on by increasing social commentary of the inequality that existed in society. So remember, for example, during the progressive movement, Jacob Riis, who wrote How the Other Half Lives. Basically, the 1960s version of this is Michael Harrington's The Other America. And so what he says in The Other America is that maybe poverty doesn't seem to be as apparent in the United States, but there were still certainly people that were going without in the U.S. despite some of the major guarantees that government seemed to be giving them in eras like the New Deal. He argues that doesn't change the fact that tens of millions of Americans are at this very moment maimed in body and spirit, existing at levels beneath those necessary for human decency. If these people are not starving, they are hungry, and perhaps fat with hunger, for that is what cheap foods do. They are without adequate housing and education and medical care. So LBJ is affected by Michael Harrington's commentary and other exposés about poverty. So he calls for what he calls an unconditional war on poverty. And his plans are also called the Great Society plans. So he establishes the Office of Economic Opportunity, or the OEO. And what this does is it coordinates programs to increase employment opportunities. And it offers training. One of its major organizations was called the Job Corps. It also begins Head Start programs, which were basically early childhood education programs to try to, again, stop the major achievement gap in schools when students were younger. The Job Corps is not overly successful, partly because the skills that were acquired through the Job Corps quickly became obsolete. And also, just because people possessed the skills did not mean that the jobs were actually available. So as we know, increasingly, the sense of post-World War II deindustrialization is making it so that some of these manufacturing jobs are moving from urban areas in the Northeast and the Midwest to cheaper areas. So a lot of people in these urban areas are without jobs. One of the most effective parts of the Great Society program, though, were community action agencies, or CAAs. They sought to organize communities for social action. And so one of the major things that the community action agencies did was they provided legal service programs. So, one of the major things that occurs for people who are poor is they could be subject to things like housing discrimination. They cannot afford to seek legal counsel on their own, so these CAAs help them. But overall, the war on poverty was seen as a failure because it didn't commit to the redistribution of income, right? And that's really the root cause of poverty. So as we find out, most of the government spending during the war on poverty went to the non-poor. And a lot of this was through Medicare programs that were expanded. And as we know, Medicare is available for all senior citizens. So it can be actually helping wealthy people. So there's a 1970 study that concluded that the war on poverty barely scratched the surface. And again, as we know, such an ambitious social welfare program was not sustainable when the US was waging a costly $118 billion war abroad. We see that there is a continued sense of an urban decay. I already talked about this a little bit, but what we're going to see is an increasing sense of white flight. This is where white citizens who can afford to do so, when jobs leave an area, they start to move to the suburbs. And so this shows us, sorry, it's a little bit blurry, but this shows us the white areas are where the white population increased. The black areas are where the black population increased. This is decrease white and decrease black. So you see it's very clear that the white population is radiating outside of urban areas, whereas the black population is increasingly moving into these urban areas. Many people start to lose their jobs when industries start automating their production as well. And what we find is that black unemployment was about twice the rate of white unemployment. And people who are left to live in poor neighborhoods oftentimes live with really unfair living conditions in the sense that, first off, they can't afford to buy their homes as often. A lot of times they face discrimination in the real estate market, as well as even getting offered loans by the banks. Sometimes they are prone to much higher interest rates because their credit is not as sound. And so many of them are forced to rent, and their landlords oftentimes were sort of slumlords who would charge them high rents. So they'd be basically trapped in the cities. So we really see in the 60s and 70s, especially with the end of the civil rights movement and with the MLK assassination, a growth of urban black frustration as they watch their cities deteriorate around them. Between 1964 and 1968, there are going to be over 100 race-related riots in the United States. One of the major ones was the Watts riot, which took place in Los Angeles. I talk about that in the civil rights videos, so check those out if you don't remember that. The riots were actually not completely made up of the poorest of the poor. Actually, many of the people who rioted were more middle-class African Americans who were disillusioned by the fact that the Great Society reforms did not actually do as much as Lyndon Johnson promised. So actually, these are very different from the civil rights riots, or protests rather, because they were riots, right? In the civil rights movement, we know that with the exception of the Black Panther movement, for the most part, there was an emphasis on nonviolence. But with these race-related riots after Martin Luther King's assassination, you're going to see that they are much more aggressive in nature, and there is an increasing sense of white backlash that results. So sort of race relations and progress increasingly deteriorate during this period. Again, this is a great opportunity for continuity and change because we can relate this to the Black Lives Matter movement of today. All right, so I already talked about the 1968 election in a previous video, so I'm not going to talk about that again, but we know that Nixon won because he campaigned on peace with honor. We know that 1968 was a really tough year also because of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy's assassinations. And we're going to see that the 1968 election shows us that the Democratic Party was really polarized. Many of them were not very jazzed about supporting Hubert Humphrey, and they also were disillusioned by the fact that LBJ decided not to run in 1968. So Robert Kennedy, Kennedy's little brother, actually started to run for president in 1968. He started to really rally behind the Democratic Party, or the Democratic supporters, but then he's assassinated right after the California primary. So a lot of Democrats are also really crestfallen by that. So when Hubert Humphrey runs in 1968, he first of all is much less popular because he was more willing to back the Vietnam War. And he also had a strong reputation for having a really strong Cold War rhetoric. So he's much less popular than Kennedy, which is one of the reasons, again, why Nixon wins. So anyway, I said I wasn't going to talk about the election, and here I go again. Let's talk about identity politics. Oh, actually, just really quickly, just interesting images here. We see that this is a newspaper headline of LBJ shockingly announcing that he's not going to run for president. This is Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King walking through sort of the damage after a major race-related protest riot. This is an image of Martin Luther King's assassination. This is Robert Kennedy's assassination. And again, these are some major race-related riots. All right, so let's talk about the Black Power movement. So as I was saying, after Martin Luther King's death, you are going to see an increasingly militant approach towards race relations in the 1960s and 70s. This kind of shows us that there's a generational conflict taking place among the Black community, just like there was in general between, sort of the pro-Vietnam and anti-Vietnam part of the population. So the civil rights movement starts to get divided as younger African Americans start to become more militant, largely because they were disillusioned by continued racial tension. So they start to turn towards what's called Black Power, which was championed by this guy here, Stokely Carmichael, who begins the Black Panthers, who reflect a growing sense of militancy, and they call for community autonomy. The Black Panthers often dressed in a more militaristic style. Sometimes they would occupy buildings with weapons. And so this really shows us, again, this growing sense of sort of conflict, of sort of meeting white violence with their own sense of violence. We also see that there's an increase of the Pan-African sentiment during the Black Power era. More and more people were willing to embrace their sort of natural African heritage rather than to try to conform into a white world. This was the age when women increasingly started to wear their hair in the more natural Afro style rather than try to relax it, which was a very, very harmful chemical practice where Black women would straighten their hair. Often also they would try to lighten their skin. So sort of the Black is Beautiful movement started to take off during this period. And also, increasingly at the university level, civil rights activists started to work towards the development of African American and Africana studies programs. So that expansion of identity politics in the university setting was also a really tangible achievement during this era. The 1960s, the late 1960s and the 1970s were also known for the women's rights movement. This is it's sort of started actually in the early 1960s when a major iconic book comes out. It's called The Feminine Mystique, written by Betty Friedan. In this book, she writes that the problem of women was the problem that has no name. And so in other words, it was very hard to actually articulate what was difficult about the female situation in the 1960s, but in many ways what it was that women were, again, sort of relegated to the traditional sort of domestic role, and they were not really seen as being able to achieve fulfillment without conforming to marriage and childbearing. And in many ways they saw it as sort of deviating back to the days of the pre-suffragette movement in the 19-teens. So they start to really criticize this, and by the late 1960s, women are also really inspired by the civil rights movement, which is interesting. Again, think about continuity, that the earliest women's rights movement that led to the Seneca Falls Convention in the 1840s was inspired by the abolition movement. So that's a really interesting connection there. So one of the largest organizations that results from the women's rights movement was the National Organization for Women, or NOW, which was founded in 1966. This campaigned against sex discrimination at work, as well as discrimination in education. It advocated for better benefits for women in the workplace. One of the major accomplishments was the Title IX decision, which helped expand, in particular, women's sports programs. They also tried to get an Equal Rights Amendment passed, which would have made women treated completely equally in terms of pay, and this was not passed. This is also interesting because the first Equal Rights Amendment proposed was in 1923. So even though it's reintroduced in the 1970s, there still is no Equal Rights Amendment on the books, which is one of the major reasons why women are still paid about 70 cents to the dollar when compared to men. Women also really critiqued traditional notions of femininity. There were sometimes, this is an image of women burning their bras, right? So sort of criticizing that that sort of sense of conformity, and also maybe a sort of male designed beauty standard. And they also sometimes would protest beauty pageants. But some women also worked for more of just a political agenda, equalizing pay and power. Most of the women's rights participants were middle class in nature, and just like the previous slide where we talked about the Black Power movement, one of the major lasting accomplishments of the women's rights movement was that more and more colleges start to introduce women's studies programs. The 1960s and 70s also were the starting point for the gay pride movement, which certainly continues into the modern day. And one of the reasons why it happens at this period is because the draft in World War II, as well as Vietnam, means that there were more and more gay men serving in the military. And so we start to see some major openly gay organizations emerge from this period. And this was still limited mainly to more urban areas. And one of the most iconic events that really triggered gay rights to be much more organized was the Stonewall riot, which took place in New York City in 1968. The Stonewall Inn was a bar that was friendly towards the gay community. And in 1968, it was raided by the police. And so the gay community responded to that by arguing that police were harassing them, that they were unwilling, that they were unable to exist sort of freely in society. And so this leads to major protests against the police and against people who opposed the gay community. So this gives birth to the gay pride movement. The first gay pride parade took place in 1970, and gay pride has expanded dramatically since then. There are now pride parades all over the world each year. We start to see the origins of the Gay Liberation Front in the 1970s, which shows us the beginnings of some of the first major gay rights organizations. And in many ways, we see that the developments of the gay rights movement were really gradual at first. It takes a long time for gay marriage to be seriously considered by the federal government. But as we know today, by 2016, there have been major steps towards gay equality in the United States, particularly with last summer's, so 2015's, Obergefell versus Hodges Supreme Court case, which legalized gay marriage nationwide. Now, though, we are seeing in some states, this is even more recent, that in states like North Carolina, for example, there was a law passed that required people to use restrooms that correspond to their biological gender identity rather than whatever gender identity they took on, which the LGBT community argues is discriminatory. So we are still seeing that there is some push and pull with the gay rights movement. Other racial minorities, we could talk about the continuation of the Mexican American community working to expand their own rights. They start to prefer to call themselves Chicano rather than Mexican American, and some of this has to do with their refusal to conform to a traditional American identity, rather to embrace the fact that they came from another place, right? Spoke a different language, had their own sense of nationalism. So there's going to be increasing numbers of protests among the Chicano community. A group of Chicano activists emerged called the Brown Berets. We see them down here. They emerged as a Mexican organization that was sort of similar to the Black Panthers, sometimes militant in nature. We see this guy back here standing there with a gun. And they often protest, and one of the things they promoted quite a bit was land and social reforms throughout the Southwest. You also see the beginning of more and more American Indian activity. They called it the Red Pride movement. You're going to see Indian activists organize protests, they took over the area where the Battle of the Wounded Knee took place. You're going to see increasing literature published that is sort of exemplifying the Red Pride movement. One important book that was published in 1969 was Vine Deloria's Custer Died for Your Sins, where he really stresses the idea that American Indians were able to maintain their cultural identity while existing in the modern world. He also wrote a book called Red Earth, White Lies, which again gives us a sense of a major sense of nationalism among the Native American community. And they also take place in a major cross-country protest. It was called the Trail of Broken Treaties. So they march all the way to Washington, D.C. in 1972. They protested against the Bureau of Indian Affairs and their loss of land. And this was the largest American Indian protest in history. So we see some progress among the American Indian community in that in some circumstances, we see that the federal government has been more willing to grant sovereignty to some American Indian tribal groups. Some of them have been allowed to reclaim some portions of land, and they exist in to a certain extent in sovereignty, in that they are not subject to traditional U.S. taxes or laws. This is particularly the case with Indian casinos that you see in different parts of the United States. They also occupied Alcatraz Island in 1969, which really showed their distaste for Americans violating treaties and taking over their land. So we see that there is some success for regaining land, but poverty and alcoholism are still major problems among American Indians. And with Asian Americans, we see that nationalism is also increasing dramatically. We call there were some Pan-Asian societies that start to emerge. One of their major strategies was to protest the Vietnam War, largely because they saw the racist undertones with regard to the war, and they themselves were not treated particularly well in this conflict because there was quite a bit of racism against, the very derogatory term was gook, to talk about Asian Americans. And we also see, just like the women's rights movement and the Black Power movement, there are going to be more and more Asian studies programs emerge in colleges in the 1970s. So that concludes the video on the home front. We're going to talk about a few more aspects of Nixon's presidencies in the next few slides, so in the next video. And that will be it for this chapter. So thanks for watching.